Hey guys! Been a while since I did an analysis video, so I thought it'd be time for me to do another one. However, this time it's going to be a bit different. Moving forward, I'm still going to do some character analyses and episode dissections and whatnot, but I'm also going to be making videos for a new series where I dissect each Thomas movie and special in extreme depth and discuss its strengths and weaknesses, and most of all, pitch how I'd improve it or change it entirely and turn it into, well, a masterpiece. So fittingly, this series, as I call it, will be titled, How It Could Have Been a Masterpiece. Or Hick Bombs for short. Catchy, right? No? Oh well, it'll catch on. I like it. After making a video for each of the specials, I'll end the series by ranking them all and summarizing my thoughts, but that's a ways away. So for now, let's just get right into it. So of course, naturally, I'm going to be reviewing these in order, and that means I'll be starting with Calling All Engines because... Yeah, I'm not touching that for a good long while. I wouldn't even know where to start. I mean, seriously, that movie's a mess. So yeah, we're starting with this one. So before we begin dissecting, let's discuss some background on the film and summarize its plot. Plot summary and background. A new airport is being built on the island of Sodor to allow for more holidaymakers and tourists to come to the island more easily, which would make the railway busier and more successful than ever. The engines all must work together to take on this large project, but due to the ever-present rivalry between steam and diesel, a conflict breaks out, and due to that, plus a severe storm that hits the island, all progress is halted and the project is barely started and the island is left in shambles. Can Thomas bring the steamies and diesels together to finish the airport on time? You find out in this movie. So an important thing to note is that this special was the first model series special and special in general following Magic Railroad, and it takes place right after season 8, so it's basically the beginning of the hit era. Does it lay the groundwork for future specials in fashion? But I can see how it laid the groundwork, but the next one is really where the specials become special. This just feels like an extended special episode, not a movie, and I'm far from the only person to say that. For a special for the 60th anniversary, this special isn't anything really, well, special. I mean, yeah, it is an ensemble and features a lot of fun characters, not as many as The Great Discovery, but we'll talk about that when we get to that movie. And it had Diesel 10 and Lady, which is cool, but has the whole standard Steamies versus Diesels conflict and a generic kiddie teamwork message. It's also boring and unoriginal. Don't get me wrong, I get why some kids like it. I kinda did as a kid, but I never loved it as much as the other movies, for sure. I liked it when it was one of the only movies we had, but then once more came out, I stopped watching it, as most of the movies are undoubtedly much better than this one. Now with the background out of the way, let's finally get into the movie itself. When I say I'm going to be breaking down everything, I mean everything. Every little detail in every scene. Broken down. Right here. That is why this video is so long, but it's also why I think you guys will like it so much. As while many other people have reviewed the specials, not many have gone as fully in depth as I have, and I like to think that's going to make my analysis series stand out, along with the whole fixing it into a masterpiece theme. So anyway, let's go. I'm really excited to do this with you guys. So first off, I'd just like to say that I love the 4:3 aspect ratio. It's the aspect ratio that most sitcoms and kids shows up to until the mid-2000s used, and for that I have a lot of nostalgia for it. It's classic. Now when I say aspect ratio, I mean where the two black bars on the screen are. They're on the left and the right as opposed to the top and the bottom, which is, like I said, an aspect ratio. Unfortunately, not many use it anymore. It's underrated and overlooked, but some still use it, like Zack Snyder's Justice League. If you want to learn more about this topic, I highly recommend looking it up online and especially on YouTube. There's a lot of interesting stuff about it I only recently learned. Anywho, here it makes the engines look bigger and forces us to focus on the screen, as it narrows our field of view into a square. I like it a lot. I'm a big fan of this look for Thomas. So we open with the standard hit era, making tracks to great destinations opening, and it makes it less cinematic. I get why it's being used, but it perfectly summarizes why this series became viewed as a generic, unoriginal kids show. Because during this era, it was that, and it shows in even the intro. It had a good cast of characters, even though the show used to have a larger and much better cast, but they threw them out. It has a good message, but yeah, it's still generic. As always, I'd like to say, the sets look great, especially the new airport and suspension bridges sets. They're both pretty cool. That goes without saying. End of that. So then, once we get into the movie, it begins with a piece of generic narration and exposition to set the stage. This becomes a norm for the films, but it's a decent one admittedly. Sets up the theme of sightseers, new places, and exploring, including the new Sodor suspension bridge, which is here to stay. It also sets up the main cast and their critical place in Tidmouth Sheds as, well, it's their home, and that is the place for them to gather, which leads to Emily joining later, but we'll get into that. So the story starts when Topham comes down to greet the engines and informs them of the plans of the new airport, setting the stage for the rest of the film. Nothing too special here, just set shit up and Thomas and Percy as our two main characters. But yeah, otherwise just standard hit era dialogue. Okay, so this is something I want to talk about really quick. The problem with hit era dialogue. Now the problem with hit era dialogue is that unlike dialogue in classic Thomas, it's oversimplified, flanderizing, and talks down to kids like they're idiots. They use simple words and phrases to make sure kids understand, but they obviously will. I know I did. Classic Thomas was awesome in how it never talked down to kids. Literally, you can see it in the dialogue. They weren't afraid to toss around bigger words and say what they meant, not flanderizing a single thing. That added character and depth and was so much better. That's just not here, and that's part of the bigger problem with the hit era. It flanderizes and oversimplifies the stories, the characters, everything, and you can just tell by listening to the small details, or lack thereof, in the dialogue. Moving on, this leads into the first song and montage, called Busy. For what it's worth, the songs in this movie are pretty good, especially the next one, but more on that later. Anywho, this song is just basically a montage of the engines getting, well, busy, and doing work that helps in the airport effort, which we see more of in a minute. I think that they rushed into a montage way too fast. It's rather jarring and would have been much more effective if we had gotten another scene or two of Thomas working with Percy for a bit and anticipating the airport, or them discussing the new airport with Edward and how it'll be tiring but also exciting, and then Edward encourages them and that leads to the montage. Personally, I think that would have worked better, would have made the transition much more natural and less rushed. But yeah, song's pretty good, it's just ushered in far too early. Also, I'd like to note that most of the footage here is just season 8 stuff or footage we just saw in the film and not new footage, which is fine to save money, but I mean, I noticed it as a kid and I do now, and it's a little meh, and it makes it look cheap, which it is, despite good production value overall, but the montage is just cheap. While there is a fair bit of new footage, which I appreciate, I just think it would have improved and worked more effectively if more new footage was used. Would have made it much more exciting as we're still in the beginning of the film and all the new footage could get you excited for the rest of the movie, but I'm nitpicking. Not unlike Nando v Movies' podcast, Mostly Nitpicking, which you should totally check out. So we then cut to Thomas and Percy at the airport building site, who are greeted with bumps and insults from Ari and Bert, beginning the overall conflict of the film, emphasizing that the Steamies don't like the Diesels and they don't like them. Which isn't true, only some of the Diesels suck, which is shown later, but still. So the message is flanderizing and inaccurate, but more on that again later. And most of all, they're different. Yep, racism metaphor, which is fine, kinda, but it just could have been done more tastefully. This then leads into the first damn learning segment in this film. Okay, so let's get the obvious out of the way. The worst part of this special is by far and unquestionably the learning segments. They're demeaning, even for kids, patronizing, and always point out the obvious. Now, admittedly, I liked some of the learning segments as a kid, like the one about Diesels versus Steamies, but for most of them, no, not at all. I found them boring, stupid, and pointless, and didn't like them at all, and I know a lot of people feel the same. They're just so, ugh. Need I say more? They suck, and they pander, and point out the obvious, and talk down to kids, which Thomas was previously known and prided for not doing, until the hit era, only for it to stop again in the Brenner era, and then again in All Engines Go. Most of all, it disrupts the film. It was annoying to kid me, it's annoying to adult me, and it's annoying to most kids and adults alike who like Thomas in general. To end this rant, I'll just say this. Thomas isn't meant to be just for babies. It's better than that. It's always been better than that. Thomas was made in a way that kids of all ages and even teens and adults could enjoy it if they just suspended their doubt due to its label as a kids show and watched for what it is. Good fun with excellent filmmaking, memorable characters, and meaningful messages, all of which the hit era mostly disregarded. But some characters like Gordon and James were still pretty good, but again, flanderized. But yeah, Thomas wasn't always understandable for babies, a bit advanced, but I mean the action and the characters and them being trains made it all the better, and I always liked it as a baby. And as I got older, I understood it more and grew to appreciate it more and more, and that's still to this day. My vocabulary improved, it helped continue building the values and morals my parents taught me, and I learned a lot about characters and people.
Everything I learned about people, I learned from Thomas.
Oh, you had to bring your sticker book, did you?
I always bring my stickers with me, you know that.
And overall, I'll be honest, it just made me a better person, and I mean that, seriously. So yeah, end of rant, and basically why Classic and Brenner era Thomas good, and Hit era plus Bubba era bad. Also, All Engines Go is the worst fucking thing to ever be created. Anyway, back to the whatever movie. As I said, the learning segments ruined the flow of the film and just interrupt it a lot, and the film would be much better without them. It'd still be mediocre, but it'd be better. Trust me, I watched a version of this film with all learning segments cut out and I liked it a lot more. But for the purposes of this review, I watched it with the learning segments. Anyway, you guys know this stuff. Moving on. So Thomas heads off to the timber yard and runs into Ari and Bert, who continue to berate him and assert their superiority, annoying Thomas and awakening his cheekiness. Now, I do like that aspect of the film, Thomas's cheekiness. That is one thing the Hit era and Bubba era, you know what, scratch that, just the Hit era. He's an idiot in Bubba, and I hate that shit. That is one thing the Hit era did get right. Thomas has a good heart, but is a cheeky little bastard and does shitty things when he's pissed, like a lot of us. But, of course, he does some shit right here. He sabotages the Diesel's load, and it holds them up. Also, Thomas's laugh here, well, Michael Brandon's laugh, is hilarious. Now, whatever, implications of bullying and racism, I don't know. I think Thomas just wanted to get back at them for being assholes, which is understandable, but two wrongs don't make a right, blah blah blah. But this is Thomas, and sometimes the engines deliver karma, but most of the time it bites them in the ass, and karma gets them, and the original problematic individual. Anyway, yeah, ramble, I'm sorry. However, little does Thomas know that their important job was to deliver timber to help build the new sheds. So this is one of the instances where it comes back to bite him in the ass. Decent message about karma. Moving on. So Thomas and Percy shunt and do tank engine things. Cute. And then we meet Diesel, who stands up for the twins and assures Thomas he won't fuck with him, which only encourages Thomas which only encourages Thomas in his cheekiness. Now I must say, I really like Diesel's characterization in this film, and the Hit era in general. He's not some petty, flanderized, just plain annoying and frankly stupid version of himself like he is in CGI. He's mean, firm, gruff, blunt, and does whatever he wants. Now that's Diesel. Perfect. And then, another learning segment, and it's stupid. Bananas? Really? Childish. Too childish. And JBS did it too. And I defend the hell out of that movie. But I'll admit, it's kind of fun to pick out how to play a trick with Thomas, but they could have gotten so much more creative with it. Like, for example, we take a shot at Thomas, and he looks at each truck, and the narrator is like, Thomas had a cheeky, naughty idea, but he didn't know how to do it. He looked at the trucks and thought, maybe I can give him the wrong trucks. Thomas then looks around, not for too long, and then comes across the truck with, I don't know, party stuff, fish, I'm not sure. The bananas thing is kind of funny, but just over the top. But then just keep the rest of that after the same. But yeah, good to see Thomas being cheeky. I like it. Oh, sorry, are we still watching the movie? And now our leading duo heads off to the scrapyard and they meet the Grim Reaper himself. Tell me in the comments if you got that. Did you get the reference? Did you get it? They meet the devil himself, Diesel 10, and his introduction is pretty good. He's silent, and we just get to observe an impressive display of his horrifying claw and his matchingly menacing face, with some solid intimidating shots, and a pretty cool sound effect for his claw too, played to a pretty solid theme just for him. So then of course, the two scamper off. This is pretty good foreshadowing for the rest of the film, and begins the gradual lead up to Thomas's meeting with him. Not too subtle, but good stuff. We'll see him again soon. Wait, shit! You can see one of the new nice faces and it sucks! I'll get back to that. We follow our two favorite troublemakers back to the sheds, but as they puff their way back home, they find the fruits of their labor, or lack thereof, all around them as none of the building projects are going well and little progress has been made, much to their dismay. I like how quickly their actions come back to bite them and they soon realize that they made a huge mistake messing with the Diesels, regretting it only once they have to pay the price. Solid lesson. And then of course they arrive at Tidmouth to discover their home has been demolished, which is the most major consequence of all, as most of their closest friends have to pay the price as well. The Diesels told them their work was important, but they didn't listen, and this is what they get. So yeah, this is when the conflict really begins. Everyone gets pissed with one another, and Thomas's guilt sets in, as he knows it's completely his fault, and that starts his redemptive arc for the film. The sheds being torn down kind of represents that everything the engines had or thought they had has been torn to shreds, and they metaphorically and literally have to start over, as their world, especially Thomas's, comes crumbling down. And I guess it kind of goes the same about our knowledge of Thomas too when it comes to this era and how it treats Thomas. It knocked it down and rebuilt it back up. It looks nice and pretend it's better, but it's not. Okay, well in this case the sheds do look pretty nice, but that's not the point. That's probably too deep. But it is a good, surprising moment, forcing the engines to come out of their comfort zones and attempt to find solace elsewhere, as their egos are bruised and pet peeves are agitated. All the places the engines are forced to sleep are actually kind of cool and creative, especially Gordon's tent. That never fails to make me laugh. I don't know how Henry and Percy could sleep with the smelters though. That's basically like sleeping in a graveyard. I'm sure they could have slept elsewhere. So Thomas gets paired with Emily, who he attempts to share his grief with, but is denied, expressing she merely wants to sleep. I like the little arc with Emily, as she acts as though she despises the fact that she must share her shed with him, and finds him annoying, when in reality, she's lonely, and desires company, but is unable to show it. But thanks to her arc and friendship with Thomas, she's able to realize this and decides to overcome her cold nature and invite others in. And this comes full circle when she is invited to Tidmouth Sheds. Sure, she's still bossy after this, but this is when her friendship with the main seven really blossoms. You see, this is how you integrate a new cast member. You don't rush them in and force the audience to accept their place, which is particularly annoying when they replace someone we're fond of, but you introduce them, give them some time to shine as a secondary character, and then over time gradually let them come into the spotlight more, until they feel like they've earned their place as a main player. That is how you do it, and I must give Hit props for that. The main seven did need a female engine, and although I think we should have had more main female characters for a while, in which we had a few in the classic series but needed more, I love the vast cast of Thomas for what it is, and Thomas has a lot of great female characters, and Emily is undoubtedly the best, and when they shine, they really shine. But they always should have had more major female characters in my opinion. Not replace anyone, but should have had more major female characters. In the end, Nia and Rebecca were rushed in and replaced two of our favorites, and two of the OGs, and that's why people don't like them. I'll be honest, I developed a bit of a soft spot for them because of their character, but I'll still never accept them as truly great characters. If they had more development and time to shine, they would have been better. All the development they get in seasons 23 and 24 after they became mains should have come before that. Just like with Emily. If you had had them have like a whole season of development and then have them come into the main cast, no one would be complaining. No one. Especially if they didn't replace anyone. And I know you guys agree with me. Even the ones that like Rebecca and Nia feel the exact same way. Okay, rant over. We still have plenty more to go. However, a big storm hits Sodor that night, and it devastates the island and much of its structures and landscape. I never really appreciated how great this storm looks. The collapse of the bridge especially looks phenomenal. I only wish I saw that being filmed in person. But yeah, this plus the scene that follows conveys the mere power and destruction of the storm very well. This is serious, and we know it. Anywho, the next morning we follow Thomas as he explores the island and discovers the damage and destruction of the storm. And like I said, the scene does its job, as most of the engine's hope for the airport to be completed is shattered. One detail I like is that after Percy asks about it, Topham declares that repairing Tidmouth Sheds is at the bottom of their priority list, as there are much more important matters at hand. The engines continue to pay for Thomas's selfish acts when they need their sheds most, and I'm surprised their anger with him isn't emphasized further. Maybe there could have been revealed that it was Thomas who did it and the engines get mad at him and the rest of the film depicts him redeeming himself. Nah, that's a bit generic. I appreciate the more personal redemption of the film. Only Thomas knows of his mistake, and he has to live with it, and he has to overcome his guilt and make things right. I like it. Another learning segment. Just tell us in narration, or better yet, show us who's doing what instead of asking us, who should do what? It's boring and tedious. Also, Harvey's here. Cool. even though he's still relatively new at the time, but is already fading into the background. Stupid hit not using their cast well to tell more unique stories and not just use Thomas. I mean, that wouldn't have saved bad stories, but it would have made them more unique. I guess it's good that only Thomas gets ruined, but at the same time, that's the worst because he's the main character and needs to be treated the best. Otherwise, how else is everything gonna work? In the next scene, it's further emphasized how pissed everyone is at each other. Good. Continues building tension. We meet Diesel 10 again, as menacing as ever, and even get a nice shot that makes Thomas look like a terrified child staring at the horrifying behemoth Diesel 10. Nice. So Thomas is tasked with the important job of delivering the bridge girder, and is enthralled at the prospect, but is discouraged by Diesel, but is determined to try. He takes the opportunity to redeem himself and proves his worth by working his hardest and getting the job done without complaint. It would have been better, admittedly, if instead of Thomas saying, "I'm a steamy, I can do it just fine," he could say, "I don't care what you think, Diesel. I'm a steamy and I can do anything." Further helping build the arc that anyone can do anything if they believe in themselves and stop being a jerk and accept help. But then again, Thomas does this on his own, and that's great. We have to do jobs on our own to be successful, and it helps improve himself. But if he had accepted help, it would have made things easier. But because of his beef with Diesel, he refuses, indicating his ego and prejudice. But he ultimately learns they all have to work together, blah blah blah, so it helps the teamwork arc a lot. It's just also generic and boring and flanderizing, because not all Diesels are bad, but it's whatever. Wait, where am I going with this? Sorry. Basically, this works. It would have been better if Thomas acknowledged he had nothing to prove, would have improved the message in my opinion, but maybe that's just part of his arc, that he thinks he has to prove himself. Okay, yeah, I like that, but that was just a suggestion. Anyway, we then get the next and best song, Try to Do Things Better, an awesome song about the rivalry between Steam and Diesel and how they constantly try to demonstrate superiority and fight to one-up each other. Y'all know how I feel about the Steam v Diesel thing. It's dumb and has run its course and has been done better elsewhere, especially in fan series, but is most prevalent here and it's whatever. The song slaps though and demonstrates the message well, and in the context of the movie is just generic. But in general, outside of the movie in regards to being a theme of the entire series, I like it. So yeah, awesome song. I remember seeing an edit with this song over lots of Day of the Diesels and other CGI footage as a kid, and I loved it. I think the rivalry is much cooler in more serious and complex situations like Day of the Diesels. Well, conceptually at least. The execution there is bleh. And especially in fan series like Cactuses, where it's not all black and white and is much more than that. But I won't spoil this series. It's awesome. Please go watch Cactus 1907-06's series. It's so good. It's the best portrayal of the Steamies versus Diesels arc. I mean, seriously. It's my biggest inspiration. So anyway, yeah, song good. Rivalry in general okay, but movie whatever. Also, holy shit, it's Derek, and the song even kind of references his difficulty with hills. Whoa, that was cool. Why didn't you use it? I appreciate how much Thomas has to pay for his ego getting the better of him as he struggles immensely to deliver the bridge section, and then especially with helping lower the section. But it was pretty cool when he got it done. It was just unnecessary for him to do it on his own. Like, don't get me wrong, it works for the story, but the point I'm trying to make is that it was logically unnecessary for him to do it by himself, and it would have been easier if he had just accepted help, and he learns that later. So Topham and the workmen had faith in him, and it pays off. Thomas ends up redeeming himself a bit through this, only halfway because of his ego, and Diesel watches reluctantly and is proven wrong, but this only further proves their rivalry. Pretty okay stuff, decent subtlety here. Thomas is often either great or terrible at subtlety. This movie is meh at it, but it's alright. No, you know what? I take that back. Not much subtlety in this movie. Especially after Thomas's declares Steamies are better than Diesels, which I originally cheered for as a kid, but now understand why that's counterproductive. And it enrages Diesel, fueling the flame of the raging conflict between Steamies and Diesels, leading to the big fight. I must admit though, it's pretty ineffective to only bring in one section at a time, but I get that Thomas was the main one available at the time. Also, yeah, if you're wondering, it doesn't bother me as much that in the Hit era and even sometimes Brenner era, Thomas isn't always working on his branch line and does odd jobs. Okay, I admit, it bothers me a little bit, but I like the idea that Thomas does a lot of freelance work to keep things interesting, as he did say he wants to see the world, so he does so by doing more jobs around the island. I'm definitely making a story to explore that sometime. Also, the music here, much like in the rest of the Hit and early Brenner era, is pretty solid and catchy. The Hartshorns have a lot of bouncy and energetic, but also relaxed and slow themes, and I admire their range. Not quite as great as Mike and Junior, but I respect them a lot, and I love their work in Great Discovery and the Brenner era most. but they still have plenty of great themes in the Hit and even Miller era, definitely one of the best parts of those eras. So in the next scene, Karma catches up with Thomas for being pompous, and Diesel delivers it crudely by throwing a truck full of paint all over him, creating a delicious mess of a state for Thomas, which creates an iconic piece of Thomas merch. You kind of feel bad for him, but he does kind of deserve it. Thomas then takes his anger out on Airy instead of Diesel for some reason, maybe just out of spite for all Diesels, and biffs him into a pile of rocks. This, my friends, kickstarts what is deemed the big fight scene, where almost all the ones in the Hit era, Diesels and Steamies battle it out in a blaze of glory as they biff, bash, and throw one another off the rails and into a glorious mess. It's awesome, and messy, and over the top, and easily the best scene in the film. I've seen some pretty awesome remakes of it with even more Diesels and Steamies, and that makes it all the cooler. Shame how small Hit made the cast. Even when they introduced new engines, it still felt small as they never used them. Until CGI and Brenner came along. Well, mostly Brenner. But yeah, until this point, the engines have never been so violent with one another, and it's the first time we see fights in the show, and it's awesome. It's a kid's show, I know, but some fight scenes are cool every now and then. But Thomas mostly kills it with action in general, and it's mostly not fight scenes, it's runaways, races, competitions, or just some crazy ass shit going on, and I love it. But it's nice to mix it up here, and it does that again in Lost Treasure, Great Race, and Journey Beyond, and I love that. Also, if you want to see some more train fights, watch Tobias and the Half Pariah. The fights and cinematography and, well, almost everything else in that film are awesome, and show the true potential of that kind of action in Thomas. We don't need fight scenes, but it's sure as hell fun to see shit get heated between the engines and things turn physical sometimes. It's badass. This leaves all the engines in a terrible mess and forces them to reflect on their actions, but the rivalry and spite remains. Fittingly, Topham scolds them and informs them that nothing will be done on time, drowning their hopes for the future. This leads into another surprisingly great scene, one that depicts the various nightmares that the engines form in their minds following the unfortunate news, fearing the worst. It's rather unwarranted because, it's not like Topham's going to scrap any of the engines or anything's going to happen to them. It's cool to see their worst nightmares though. James is afraid of being laughed at and becoming a mindless object of humor, belittlement, and entertainment, even by Sir Topham Hatt. Percy fears being on an endless roller coaster ride and constantly on the verge of a crash, probably due to how many runaways and crashes he's dealt with. He never could catch a break in the classic series, could he? So it makes sense. Similar to James, Gordon fears becoming a belittled and oversized vessel of entertainment for children, and not the good kind like he is now. An unfitting end for a Grand Express engine, and one of the LNER's, and Railways in general's, greatest and most iconic locomotives. The main difference between his and James's nightmare, though, is that James receives much negative and unwanted attention, contrasted with how much positive attention he usually craves, versus Gordon, who goes from being a Grand Express engine to little more than a plaything for children, insignificant and mindless. Both of these nightmares are equally bruising for each of their egos. Just wanted to point that out. I thought it was interesting. Interestingly, Edward fears being forgotten in a field and left as a scarecrow, which may or may not be accurate for his character, but for the purposes of this analysis, I'd say that it's because of how much he's contributed to the railway and how loved he's become and how much he values in his life, especially his friends, passengers, and work. He fears most that he'll be forgotten and become lost to time and history, rendering all his work meaningless. In most incarnations, Edward likely doesn't fear dying nor cares for being the best at anything, but he prides himself on his work and kindness and does want to be remembered by his friends and for all his hard work, so it all meant something, as it's all he cares about, the impact he leaves on others. So for it all to be forgotten, well, that's his worst nightmare. And then of course Thomas has the most straightforward and generic dream. Nothing much to dissect here aside from Lady's appearance, which is really interesting. I guess her and Diesel 10 are both here especially to celebrate the 65th anniversary, as they are mostly movie exclusive characters. But I think it's interesting that Thomas dreams about her. Perhaps she's not the avatar or creator of life for engines, but maybe she is still like a mystical and mysterious figure that the engines hold in high regard and look up to. So it makes sense for Thomas to see her and for her to tell Thomas that the only way forward is by working together. It's also interesting to hear that she works in the mountains. Muffle Mountain, maybe? Also interesting to see Rusty, especially in a Season 4 model. And it's even more notable because of their different gauges. I guess they really wanted to emphasize the whole concept of being different here. So yeah, the dreams are actually pretty cool, over the top, and interesting in concept, and I'm glad they exist, but Plot-wise, they don't make a lot of sense and could have been a bit more in-depth to make it more interesting. But then again, I did just look at them in depth and found them to be very interesting, so hypocritical much? Don't worry about it, moving on. Still doesn't make much sense. So the next morning, Thomas wakes up enlightened with the prospect that yes, Steamies and Diesels can work together, which we already knew, but the hit era is kind of a reboot of the series, so I guess it makes sense. I don't know. And goes to find Mavis, which I thought he said all Diesels suck, so why is it so sudden? They should have acknowledged earlier in the film that not all Diesels are mean and that some are kind and sympathetic. I guess that would have made the message not black and white enough. Literally, no gray areas except for Mavis. It doesn't make sense. But admittedly, the pairing with Mavis was an interesting one. She used to be rowdy, bossy, and hard-headed, but is now a laid-back, mature, and well-rounded engine, which is an awesome arc, by the way. So it makes sense for Thomas to pair with her, even though they've never interacted before. Wait. Then no, it doesn't make sense. So maybe instead of this, he would have met Mavis earlier in the film, and she'd be all nice and stuff, and he'd be a bit mean, but then he'd have the dream and realize he was too harsh. Because, Salty's his friend, so she can be too, right? So then he goes back to her asking for forgiveness and tasks her with assisting him in rounding up the engines to come to a huge meeting where they can finally settle their differences. Now, wouldn't that be better? Anywho, the two decide to set up the aforementioned meeting, which is, obviously, the best and most direct solution as they spread the word. The only engine they haven't told is Diesel 10, who poor Thomas cannot muster the courage to even reference by name. It would have been interesting to see both Mavis and Thomas approach him, and we watch Thomas stay back, fearing for his safety, and then Mavis, who's nervous as well, would pull forward and politely inform him of the meeting. For dramatic purposes, we would watch this exchange from behind, from Thomas's point of view, and we wouldn't really hear the conversation, and then after 5 to 10 seconds, Mavis would move back and simply say, "He said no," and they'd move on. I actually like that idea a lot. Also, the narrator says,
"All the engines on the island,"
which is obviously not true, but whatever, it's the hit era. And even at the meeting, not even all the engines seen in the film are there. Another thing is the narrator kind of justifies Thomas's thought process when he says,
"He was sure Diesel 10 would never work with the Steamies anyway."
Cute, getting inside his head. Too far from the sheds, Thomas finds a lonely siding to hold up for the night in which his absence helps with Emily's arc that I mentioned before, in which here, she realizes that she actually misses Thomas. Also, the moment with Topham eating a cream donut. Classic. Anyway, we then cut to the engine's big meeting. Another decent, albeit flawed scene in this film. Upon arrival, you'll immediately notice that all the Steamies appear to have come open-minded and prepared to engage in a polite discussion, as they're wearing happy faces, while the Diesels idle on the other side of the yard, staring with looks of contempt and reluctance. Thomas is yet to arrive because of how far away he is. So Mavis attempts to hold things together, but the meeting begins to fall apart as engines start to point buffers at one another, and it turns from conversation to heated argument. Thankfully, Thomas rushes in before a fight breaks out and tries his hardest to maintain the peace and facilitate a productive conversation. Now, the thing is, he says like 3 sentences and everything is resolved. That's kind of dumb, and it kind of makes the whole resolution look rushed and pointless. I get we have to save time and this is a simple movie, but again, if this film wanted to be impactful, meaningful, and memorable, it should have taken the time to make more interesting choices, better dialogue, and go more in depth beyond the superficial layers of its ideas and story. And this is one of those times it could have done that. The Steamies and Diesels could have argued with Thomas a bit more, only for Thomas to ultimately calm them all down again and resolve the issue like in the film. With just a little bit more dialogue and fighting added, this scene would have been much better and less rushed. Topham then arrives just in time as the meeting concludes and is proud to hear of the unanimous conclusion that everyone will work together. And before I finish my talk about this scene, yes, it's very cool that Daisy is here. Much like Sodor's Legend of the Lost Treasure, she just appears for fan service, or in this case, just to add another Diesel. It would have been cooler to see Derek, but she doesn't do shit. But at least in Sodor's Legend of the Lost Treasure's case, she comes back for a 5-episode arc in the next 2 seasons, but here we don't see her again in the following season, so... Also, where the hell is Salty and Harvey? They cameo in the film, but aren't even mentioned at the meeting. Everyone on Sodor. Bullshit! Not even all the engines shown in the movie, let alone every engine. Okay, yeah, they're trying to save money, but imagine if the cast was a true ensemble and we got Duck, Oliver, Donald Douglas, and Boko here to make the world feel more full and lively. They wouldn't have to do much, but it would have added a bit to the film and made it stand out a bit more. Plus, again, you could get more merch from this. And the props were still available at the time. Duck and the twins are even used in the season that follows, so there's not an excuse. Oliver was even in a wooden railway pack for this movie. Ugh, I digress. So anyway, this continues Thomas's arc in that he realized they all have to work together, so he sets aside his prejudice for the greater good and helps his friends see things the same way. Decent stuff. Ugh, this learning segment is so long, make it stop! But yeah, this learning segment was especially long and annoying. I thought I would die from boredom. Okay, now what? What kind of cut is this? What was that? What was that? You can't just abruptly cut to that shit? Where was the montage of them working together to finish building the airport? It feels so incomplete without it. Okay, so this is an easy fix. Just add a montage here of them working together instead of the stupid learning segment, and then cut to this. It feels so jarring and first draft-esque as is. The airport does admittedly look pretty cool, bright, and colorful, but also not inaccurate. Very easy to turn into merch. I even have it in wooden railway. It's pretty cool. Anywho, it's cool that Sodor is finally getting its own airport. I guess people had to take a plane to England and then either take a train or boat from there to get to Sodor. I guess now it'll be more popular than ever. Cool. Now, I originally thought this was stupid. Thomas makes another mistake. Well, it's not really his fault. And some trucks crash into the water tower near the runway, in spectacular fashion by the way, and it causes a large pile of debris to land on the runway, and the runway cracks under the pressure, rendering it unsafe to land on. This of course infuriates the engines, especially the diesels who blame it on Thomas both because it was, well, Thomas, and because he's a steamy, and then of course, because he's the only engine available to clean it up, Thomas is forced to go find Diesel 10. I originally thought that this was unnecessary and stupid to make Thomas mess things up again when maybe, instead, the whole team could have needed help earlier during construction and that would force Diesel 10 to come. But then I thought about it and realized this actually works. Thomas makes another mistake, one more so out of his control, and is forced once again to realize and accept the fact that he's not perfect and does in fact need help from a diesel. One diesel specifically in fact. The worst of the worst. He had condoned, encouraged, and engaged in help from diesels, but didn't quite believe he could ever ask for help from the worst. But sometimes you have to work with those you don't like, and he's now forced to do so. He has to accept help from the one engine who makes him more terrified and uncomfortable than anyone else. And it matures him and opens his eyes. They'll never be friends, but when shit hits the fan, you gotta take help from whoever you can. Well, some exceptions. Diesel 10 would usually be an exception, but I mean, this is Thomas and Friends, so it's fine. This completes his arc of fully accepting help from diesels and becoming a better engine. Anywho, the confrontation itself is pretty good. Diesel 10 is as intimidating as ever thanks to his scary face masks and a great, gruff, and a short-tempered, tame, monster-like voice from Brandon. I don't know about Angelus, I'm sure he did good too. Thomas approaches Diesel 10 and begins by whispering like a terrified child asking for help from a stranger, and he's met with a growl, but pumps up courage to speak to him, and after Diesel 10 initially tries to scare him and rejects the notion entirely, Thomas even raises his voice and stands his ground and eventually convinces him by reasoning that the airport is good for all engines, and it is vital that it's made safe immediately, or the railway could lose a lot of money. But most of all, he emphasizes that Diesel 10 would be a hero, which ultimately wins him over. I like that he appealed to his ego because Diesel 10 probably does have a hero complex, but more on that in another video. So yeah, great confrontation, just a bit rushed, and I wish Diesel 10 was a bit scarier because then in the following scenes this is even more apparent when he dons the new hit era Nice Faces, which completely tarnish his image as a heartless, horrifying brute and make him seem like a big old softy, which I mean, no, not at all. He's funny at best, but never kind or soft. Maybe in some fan series I love seeing an occasionally vulnerable, more complex Diesel 10, but in the main series, he should have stuck to being scary, and he could have still been scary even when helping if he just wore the scary smile face. Also, is it just me or does his model look brighter? Never mind, all the engine's models look brighter. It is the hit era, what am I saying? I just miss the contrast and tame but still vibrant colors of the classic series versus just all bright and oversaturated. All the engines are appalled to see who Thomas brought to help, and I like that a lot. As everyone knows who Diesel 10 is, and everyone, even diesels, are afraid of him. But they're even more impressed, even the diesels, by the fact that Thomas managed to temporarily tame the beast, and even got him to help for the right cause. This inspires the rest of them to join in, and they manage to save the day and the plane lands, granting Topham and the engines an enormous win for the railway and the island. And this ultimately makes them all realize that they are equal, and when they work together, they can accomplish anything. Pretty superficial stuff. Of course, the mean Diesels forget this, but the Steamies don't, and I like that. Or at least that's what I believe. Maybe the Diesels, Ari Burton Diesel, will remember this when times get tough again, but they'll never be friends with the Steamies. Some things never change, but we can only do our best. A fine message, but better with the context I added. I just wish they implied that more in the movie instead of, again, making it all black and white with no gray area. Also, it's nice to see George. I wish he had a line or something, but I'm happy with his appearance at all. Okay, the lines of, "Working with Diesels was fun," and "Working with Steamies wasn't so bad either." Those lines are so on the nose and just bleh. But whatever. It just reminds me of how on the nose this whole movie is. Some parts of it work, and it's fine overall, but again, just generic and nothing special. However, it does get at least much more interesting in every other movie after this. Not always better, but more interesting. This film just doesn't do much besides bring back Diesel 10 and Lady and have a good song and some fun dream sequences, plus a decent but unmemorable arc for Thomas. It could have been much more interesting with more depth and better dialogue and the changes I'm proposing to make or that I've already proposed. Or at least I'd hope so, but yeah, maybe a better line like, "The Steamies and Diesels didn't always really enjoy working together, but they gladly did it for the railway." Or maybe Thomas says, "I was wrong about Diesels. You're all a great help, and I'm sorry I treated you all so wrong." And Diesel says, "Maybe you Steamies aren't complete scrap after all, but just so you know, this doesn't make us friends." After this, the narrator re-emphasized that they are different, but all just want to be useful, and again, it's cute, just generic. Good message for kids, but done so boringly. This is Thomas, and Thomas is so awesome when it wants to be, so to see it be turned into some pandering, boring, run-of-the-mill kid show is just so depressing and disappointing. It still has plenty of Thomas charm with its cast of characters, the stellar model work, memorable music, and solid narration, but the charm of the writing is almost all gone. That's my problem with this special, and the Hit/Miller era as a whole. I'm sure love and passion were still poured in, especially from the modelers, narrators, and Hartshorns, and I'm sure the writers surely tried, but it just wasn't Thomas. This is essentially what Thomas would become, but it wasn't classic Thomas, and it never would be, if that makes sense. The Hit era in this movie are fine and have some good moments, but are nothing too notable. Great Discovery is awesome though, but we'll get to that soon enough. It's very satisfying to see the plane finally come down and for all the engines to be so pleased. And the ending song is actually pretty good. I thought it would suck, and yeah, its message is very generic, but it's actually kinda endearing and cute and pretty much sums up the film, with some decently specific and fitting lyrics that aren't completely generic like some other songs. So the arc comes full circle now, with Thomas and Diesel 10, the titular arch nemesis and rivals of the series. Which isn't the case as much here, as Thomas doesn't like mean Diesels and Diesel 10 simply hates Steamies, or in the case here he's more just a jerk, or both preferably, and Thomas is just scared of him, but still. Here, they're forced to set aside their differences and work together. Sure, it could have been done better with a more climactic confrontation or argument, but I get why Thomas was mainly just scared, because this version of Thomas is still young and naive, and they both realize the value of Steamies and Diesels. It works. Kinda. Thomas accepts Diesels, but Diesel 10 will never, ever accept Steamies. And I don't like that this film implies that he's all friends with them now. Because he's not. I wish that they further emphasize that he only helped for Topham and the other Diesels, and that he'll continue to distance himself from Steamies both out of hatred and self-control, as we all know it will happen if he doesn't. But anyway, if they can set aside their differences, anyone can. And the Steamies, the kind Diesels, and even the mean Diesels never forget this. At least in my opinion. And lastly, the arc with Tin Sheds, the Steam Team, and Emily comes full circle as well, as Emily is officially welcomed into the main cast, and it feels so earned. I only wish she played a larger role in the film. Also, can I just say Michael Brandon, Angelus too, just need to shut up and not always said, "So-and-so said," or "puffed." After anyone says anything, we know who's talking if the shot is focused on them! Although generic, flanderizing, and overly childish, I like a lot of parts of this movie. However, Thomas's arc, the dreams, the fight scene, Diesel 10's inclusion, and part of his portrayal that was just ruined by the ending, but was mostly good. All of it's pretty good stuff. I enjoyed a good bit of it, but as the film goes on, the cracks begin to show, and its mediocrity becomes unavoidable. And for that, and the many reasons I've explained, it's mediocre. It's a mediocre misfire. I see what they were trying to do, and in some ways it works, and it delivers its message, but it's generic, boring, and unmemorable. And for that, it's not a masterpiece. It's not even really good. It's just okay. I used to give it a 5 out of 10, but for some reason I enjoyed it more this time. So I want to give it a 6.5, even though I don't quite think it deserves it. So my final score for this film is a 6 out of 10. Now, let's talk about how we fix this mess. Improvements and changes. Alright, so as we can tell from the analysis, there's a lot of shit wrong with this movie. So, where do we start? Well, there's not as much wrong with this movie as much as there isn't much notable about it. I honestly don't think there's much that would make this as a hit era movie too special, but I think the changes I'm about to propose, along with the many minor fixes I suggested throughout the video, could make it a lot more fun and memorable. So let's get into it. This is how Calling All Engines could have been a masterpiece. Just as a note, we're going to keep Thomas's arc the same, but with a few changes. First, get rid of the learning segments. Come up with something better, and in each instance a learning segment comes up. 2. Give Emily a bigger role. Maybe make her help Thomas round up the engines. Let her help more in the finale. I don't know. Her role in the film was great, and her place at Tin the Sheds feels earned, but I feel like one more scene with her helping Thomas would make the arc feel a little more complete. Maybe when Thomas wakes up after the lady dream, he tells Emily his plan, or when he runs into Mavis, she's nearby and she says she wants to help with the plan, so she does so. Then the following scene with her missing him while she's in her shed stays the same. You could also make her participate in the meeting more and let her defend Thomas and the Steamies, and suggest that the Diesels and Steamies need to stop fighting, but the engines don't listen, which is followed by Thomas arriving and calming things down. The rest of her arc stays the same, but I think with these changes, it feels more complete and satisfying. 3. Add Duck, Oliver, Donald, Douglas, and Boko. Just do it. It'll add to the cast and make it more memorable and interesting. Bill and Ben can even cameo too. I bet they wanted an equal number of Steamies and Diesels, and even here there isn't, but there could have been with Boko and Derek and some visiting Diesels added, but I'll get to that in a minute. Like I said, it would add on the film's cast and make it a true ensemble and improve the feeling of the Thomas world here. Plus, fan service and new merch. Kids and adult fans alike love to see more characters in the show and on the shelves. I know kid me would have been over the moon if all these guys appeared. Would have made it a lot of fun and stand out so much more. 4. Make the nightmares more relevant, like about the airport closing, the bridge never being fixed, engines continuing to crash, people leaving Sodor, and then maybe some scrap imagery. That would have made a lot more sense in my opinion. 5. As I described earlier, Thomas meets Mavis earlier in the film and has a complete arc with her. If you want to revisit that, just rewatch that part of the video. But to summarize, Thomas meets her and is mean to her due to his prejudice, has the dream, realizes he was too mean and enlists her help, which helps develop his arc of overcoming his prejudice against Diesels. Okay, Diesel 10. This is a big one. So obviously he's way too nice in this movie. Sure, he's a little scary and mean at the beginning, but then once he agreed to help, that is just completely wiped away and he's struck with "villain is nice now" disorder, and all traces of his devious and evil nature disappear. I get it for the sake of the plot, but I mean, come on. And the super happy, nice faces, seriously, that was just the final nail in the coffin. So, how do we fix it? Easy. Keep everything up to when he talks with Thomas the same. Or, well, if you want to, you could have him interact with Thomas and Percy earlier on in the film and have him threaten them and be scary to further establish him as an intimidating tank of a threat. But then again, less is more, and his lack of dialogue and the silent but powerful emphasis on him visually and music-wise works too. You decide. Then add the scene I mentioned earlier where Mavis asks him to help and he says no, but we only view the exchange from afar and don't hear it for the purposes of being dramatic. Anywho, make him more intimidating and scarier in the confrontation scene with Thomas, and of course, less nice and happy when helping at the airport. And especially, please, don't have those overly nice faces. Just use his evil grin face. But yeah, he's mostly solid in the film, but I think it can be improved. Then, essentially, he stays the same for the rest of the film, but with a few more changes I'll get into with my major rewrite, which is... Okay, so, rewrite time. Topham gets pissed with the steam engines after progress on the airport is halted, and brings over some Diesels from the mainland in effort to teach them a lesson. So, bring over some mean Diesels from the mainland to help, and so that way, the Steamies have to prove their worth to them and please Topham to let them know they learned their lesson. Now, no, of course he wasn't going to replace, let alone scrap them, but he wanted to teach them a lesson. I'd have the Diesels be D261, Derek, and introducing D199. But then again, just D261 and Derek would work too. I just wanted to add D199. But so for the purposes of this rewrite, in this version, I'm keeping him. D261 and D199 would be nasty, but Derek would be more of a pretender who just wants to work and doesn't hold the same prejudice against steamies, and by the end of the film becomes fond of them. Maybe he'd come from the mainland because he was sent back after arriving and being a failure of a diesel in season 5, or he simply stops working at the clay pits for the film and starts helping with the airport effort. In addition, like I mentioned earlier, I'd have Boko return and be a part of the diesels who take the jobs of the steamies on the airport project. But, of course, fittingly, he wouldn't be rude, just agitated. Not only would this create a much expanded and more interesting cast that allows for numerous returnees and creates the opportunity to reintroduce characters in merch and make them popular and have modern takes on them, it complements the story a lot and makes the theme all more effective as both steamies and diesels learn to value one another and not be jerks. Better than it was in the film. So of course, the steamies end up deciding to work with the diesels and prove themselves. The mainland diesels leave with their prejudice intact, but Derek especially, who Topham decides to let stay, and Boko, who never faltered in his love for steamies but was agitated and hurt by their constant insults and overall fight against diesels on the island, but his friendship and faith in them is rejuvenated at the end of the film after they decide to work together. And so they both continue to be kind to the steamies. So throughout the film, we'll observe Diesel 10 hanging out with the visiting diesels, and when Mavis tries to talk to him, he ignores her and says he only works with diesels. In the confrontation scene, he'll mention that the new diesels will take over, but agrees to help after hearing the proposition of being a hero. And then after only helping to please Topham, he's enraged when the diesels are sent away, turns on the steamies again, and vows revenge, setting up Day of the Diesels a few years later. Or just for a return at a later date. I'm sure they didn't have plans for Day of the Diesels yet, but it'd leave the door open. But the steamies learn too to be kinder to the diesels on their railway, and that although some people and engines may never change, they can only try their best to be better, kinder, and work their hardest. And that's what matters. The film ends on a similar positive note, with the engines agreeing they must work together sometimes, and their prejudice against most diesels fade, with only the mean diesels holding their prejudice intact. But even Diesel, Airy, and Bert will never forget this, and now respect the steamies a bit more. And now Thomas is a much wiser, more mature, and more open-minded engine. The end. And that, my friends, is how Calling All Engines could have been a masterpiece. I hope you all enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed making it. This is only the first in this series of in-depth retrospectives and potential rewrites of each Thomas film, and I'm enthralled to continue it, especially when we get to the specials I'm truly passionate about. But I won't spoil that. But all the same, I'm very happy with how this analysis and rewrite turned out. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and if you have any criticism or comments, leave them in the comment section below. And as always, like and subscribe. So until next time, have a good one, my friends. I can't wait to see you again. So long. Bye-bye.